Alright guys, we're just going to try and piecemeal this one together. We're going to go from the end of World War II here. Where's me at the podium? Good enough. Alright. Zoom just a tad. Soviet Union. Iron Curtain. We're going to jump back to end of World War II here. It's a happy Saturday, rainy afternoon. Missing part of my daughter's field hockey game. Here we go. August 6th, President Harry Truman had the Enola Gay drop the atomic bomb Little Boy on the town of Hiroshima. On August 9th, the boxcar will drop Fat Man on Nagasaki. When it was done, no one could believe the devastation and the destruction of what happened to those two Japanese cities. When the United States asked Japan to surrender after the Hiroshima bomb, they refused. So a couple days later, the second bomb was dropped. After that, Japanese Emperor Hirohito overruled his military, and on August 10th, he began the process of something that had been up to this point unheard of in Japan. He surrendered. On board the United States Missouri, on September 2nd, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender of the forces of Japan. And for the world, World War II was finally over. A war that had lasted 6.5 years, it claimed 69 million lives. Major sections of Europe were destroyed for the second time in 20 to 30 years. Unlike World War I, however, Germany also felt the pain and the destruction of mass warfare. They saw for the first time their towns and their villages and their countryside destroyed. Plus, there was mass genocide discovered with the Holocaust and the concentration camps. Japan was annihilated from the dropping of not one but two atomic bombs. Nearly 200,000 people were killed. And lots of other damage was done to Southeast Asian nations, also the Koreas and China. The firebombing from not only the American army in Japan, but the years of destruction the Japanese army caused. It was done. However, the ushering in of the atomic age, people felt that another such war, such as World War II, could cause the destruction of the human race. And there were several friendly agreements between the Allies going back as far as 1943. 1943, excuse me. But by 1945, things began to split. Joseph Stalin had used the war to capture more territory for what he called the Soviet Union, and had effectively increased his power. The Soviet Union declared itself the epicenter of the world, and they were dedicated to exporting their communist ideology throughout the world. The United States and Western Europe felt they had to contain the growing spread of communism. And so the world will split into two camps here. One, a capitalist camp led by the United States, and a secondary Soviet sphere, number two, a Soviet sphere led by the Soviet Union and the ideals of communism. And so, to rewind a little bit, before the United States entered World War II, several Western countries met in Canada to form the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter had used ideas from old President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points plan of peace that we were supposed to use after World War I. Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had for a time worked successfully to destroy the German Reich, the Axis powers of World War II. And there should have been a positive sentiment of goodwill that carried into the post-war period. But as we know, that was not to be so. And so as Joseph Stalin begins to reveal near the latter parts of the war, Stalin wanted to keep the occupied parts of Eastern Europe that he had taken over, things that he had gotten in his alliance with Adolf Hitler years earlier. And this starts to come out in late 1943, 1944, when there was still a long way to go in the war. The Allies agreed to deal with the political problems later. Let's finish the war and then we'll figure this out. But by mid to late 1944, Russia had pushed Germany out of the Soviet Union. Now they were back into Eastern Europe, different Slavic countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And the Red Army was able to acquire and gobble up territory quickly. Poland, Hungary, Romania, your ice skating and gymnastics countries from the Cold War. The Soviet Union had been trying to get a hold of them for years. And British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin both began to talk about how they would divide the Balkans up after the war. This had always been a traditional hot spot in Europe, a trouble spot, going back to the Ottoman and the Austrian Habsburg empires before World War I. But now, no territorial division could go forward without the approval from the United States. The U.S. did not want to divide Europe into spheres of influence. We were past that. We were beyond carving up the globe like that. And so when the Allies proved victorious in 1945, Germany itself, however, will be divided into 4 zones of occupation. One for each of the Allies, an American, a British, a French, and a Soviet sector. Matter of fact, in Berlin, the French weren't giving any territories, and when asked to give up some of theirs, the Soviets said no. If the French were going to get anything, it had to come from the U.S. or Britain. So Great Britain gave up some of their part of Berlin to the French. On top of this, Germany once again finds itself having to pay an enormous amount of war reparations, nearly 20 billion German marks. And the big question was, however, what are we going to do with Eastern Europe? Right, what are we going to do with the Viking River cruise countries? The Allies felt that the Soviet Union should be able to enjoy friendly neighbors, but no one really likes the Soviets. And the Western Allies wanted these countries, these friends of the Soviet Union, to be democratic and independent. But good old paranoid Joseph Stalin felt that this would not be in the best interest of his country. And his own psychological paranoia prevented him from believing that the Allies were going to be honest in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. So very quickly, at the end of World War II, Stalin reneges and goes back on many of the agreements and plans the Allies had made before the war ended. Alliances crumbled right here like a dried piece of cake, and the world splits into those 2 spheres, the American capitalistic one and the Soviet communist one. And as the United States and the Soviet Union were the only 2 countries left standing after World War II, when victory was achieved, both had vast economic resources, an enormous and mobilized military power. Both armies were fully geared and ready to fight. They had the power and the influence to be able to dominate the globe. And these one-time allies had started to become very bitter, angry rivals as their opposing political and economic ideologies simply just didn't line up. Capitalism and communism simply doesn't work. Ask Colin or the Honorable C. Charles Webb. It just doesn't work. Each had a deep-seated distrust of the other. And so after World War II, a new struggle quickly grows that will shape the events for much of the rest of the 20th century, known as the Cold War. It's simply a constant era of threat and tension and hostility among different nations. The United States and the Soviet Union, it's called the Cold War, did not directly get into armed combat with each other. We didn't fight toe-to-toe, but we did it through using other smaller countries indirectly. The Soviet Union, the United States never went toe-to-toe, but we did it through emissaries in third world countries. So it is here that the term the Iron Curtain is created. The Iron Curtain descends. And the early focus of the Cold War is over Eastern Europe. And Stalin had two goals in mind for Eastern Europe. Number one, he wants those friendly neighbors. The Soviet Union wants a friend. And so he wanted to spread communism throughout Eastern Europe. And secondly, he wanted a buffer, a safety net between him and Germany, a series of like-minded governments, so there was a shield between him and Germany, because Germany came oh so very close to destroying the Soviet Union. They were 8 miles from Moscow when their drive stalled out. So as the Soviet army shattered and destroyed the Nazi forces and pushed them out of Eastern Europe, Stalin left behind parts of the massive Soviet army to occupy this territory, to conquer it. Stalin wanted to heavily influence and impose his will on this territory and set up his own social and political system. As the United States and Great Britain began to bitterly complain, Stalin says, well, look, you didn't ask us what we wanted when you concluded your individual peace with Japan. You did that to Japan on your own. And our response was, yeah, but you didn't help with Japan until literally like a week before the atomic bombs were dropped. So you really didn't do anything. And he goes, well, you also did not ask us when you occupied Italy after the war. Well, you didn't do anything with Italy. We fought in Italy. You didn't even have a soldier there. He goes, that's in your perspective. In mine, what I am doing is exactly what you did to us. I'm not telling you because you didn't tell me. Now, the Western powers said, look, concluding peace was completely different than leaving behind an occupying force. We're here to look over Germany to make sure it's stabilized and rebuilt. Same with Japan. And Stalin will say, look, I will promise, wink, wink, fingers crossed, to have democratic elections in these countries. Don't you worry. But he quickly goes back on that promise. And we learn quickly that Stalin can't be trusted. The Soviet army and local communist, collaborators and sympathizers in Eastern Europe, especially Czechoslovakia, my grandparents are from, Hungary and Poland, come out quickly in support of Stalin. And they were able to beat down and destroy any opposing political thought whatsoever, especially those who were pro-democratic. So on March 5th, 1946, at tiny little Westminster College out in Missouri, British Prime Minister gives his famous speech. From Stettin to the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the great capitals all the great capitals across the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. The term Iron Curtain has descended was coined by Winston Churchill, and it is the symbol of the Cold War. It was used by the West to show the specter of growing communism, the Soviet sphere of influence, and the West's growing fear of it. And so coming out of this, immediately after the war, is something known as the Marshall Plan. And it made, communist ideals were appealing to some countries of Western Europe that were destroyed by the fighting. And the two biggest factors pushing people towards communism were poverty and hunger. So to prevent democratic governments from falling and turning to communism, the United States Secretary of State, former head of the Army, George C. Marshall, created and offered a massive aid package to the governments of Europe. It was called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan, oops, going to come back to the United States. The Marshall Plan offered an aid package, a monetary bailout to the governments of Europe. The United States will send food, billions of dollars of economic assistance to help the war-torn European countries rebuild from the destruction of World War II. This money helped the destroyed areas recover more quickly than anybody thought would ever be possible. So the United States earned the goodwill of these countries. And they were willingly able to follow the lead of the United States. And President Harry Truman, approved the Marshall Plan in areas of Eastern Europe as well. But Joseph Stalin would not allow any Eastern European country to accept this aid, saying that it was his responsibility, the responsibility of the Soviet Union, to make that happen. And so Germany becomes another focal point of the Cold War around the city of Berlin. The Soviet Union will destroy many factories in the German zones it occupied. They feared that Germany would rebuild itself and attack for the third time in the century. So in the zones that were maintained by the Americans, the British, and the French, Germany was able to rebuild their industry, their infrastructure, and their economy. The last time I was in Germany, you could still see the clear scars between East and West. East Germany was like Dorothy in her house back in Kansas. It was black and white and kind of gray and gnarly and decrepit. And then you stepped into West Germany, and it was bright and colorful like Oz. Electricity, art, new architecture, bright colors. Watch the Tom Hanks movie Bridge of Spies, all right? You can see a very tangible, palpable difference between the two. And so West Germany is able to rebuild their industry and their infrastructure. And so Germany will be divided into two nations here. West Germany, democratic Germany, that writes a democratic constitution. It was allowed to govern itself, and it received Western American economic aid and became an industrial powerhouse. While East Germany was governed by a communist government, it was heavily regulated by Moscow. In the capital city of Berlin, which lie in the Soviet sphere, was also divided into 4 zones. 3 Western Allied zones, as I said, an American, a British, and a French, surrounded by communist territory. So you have communism around the city of Berlin, and the city of Berlin was a small pocket of democracy. Think of like a bullseye. It was the round target in the middle. And it becomes the first flashpoint of the Cold War. And it comes in the form of the crisis over Berlin. In 1948, Stalin tries to push the Allies out of Berlin by cutting off all access to railroads, roadways, and even bridges. And so what happened next is called the Berlin Airlift. With the Army Air Force still over there, we began to load food and cargo into ships. We would fly over Berlin and drop them off. And the thing that people said they appreciated most was the magical Hershey bar. Food, medicine, supplies were dropped around the clock. Not wanting to shoot down an American plane, Stalin was forced to back down. But the embarrassment led to the deepening and hostility between the former Allies. The Cold War had begun. And so it is at this point that the arms race will start, as both the United States and the Soviet Union will arm ourselves to the teeth. And in between this time, a new thing is going to be created, something that many of you are familiar with, the Model UNers in here. And in April of 1945, we'll come back to the Cold War tomorrow, 51 nations are going to meet outside San Francisco in the redwood forest of Muir Woods. And they are going to create the United Nations Charter. Since its inception, my daughter Bethany's got a great story about Muir Woods. When we were there, she was really, really mad at me. So someone asked her what happens. But don't, because then she'll get mad at me. Anyway, back on point. In the redwoods, the United Nations is going to be created. And since its inception, the United Nations is going to play a large role in world affairs. In the United Nations, every member country has a seat in the General Assembly, where every vote is equal. Think of it as the United States House of Representatives on a world scale. The countries meet to discuss and debate pressing issues and concerns facing the entire world. Separate from this is the Security Council. Think of it as the United States Senate. It is more prestigious. And the Security Council will have 15 member nations. 5 of those nations have permanent seats. The United States, Great Britain, France, the victorious powers from World War II who are allied, the Soviet Union, and due to its massive size and population, China. The other 10 member countries rotate every so many years. And the Security Council's job is to keep and enforce the peace on a world scale, which we know is extremely difficult. Security of the world is paramount, and the 5 permanent members have the power to veto each other. Any action or international law being passed that the other one doesn't, that someone doesn't like, they can veto it. So you can imagine during the upcoming Cold War, when I talk about the Truman Doctrine, whatever the Soviets want to do, we veto. Whatever we want to do, the Soviets veto. All 5 have to agree on something called consensus, which means everybody agrees and is on board. However, with the growing Cold War in the 1950s, the ideological differences between the powerful Soviet Union and United States prevented the United Nations from taking real meaningful, concrete action on many issues, especially those that were controversial. Fortunately, most of the early work of the United Nations does get done. And even today, the UN will take a bad rep. There are some really good things that it does. Preventing and trying to eradicate disease, improving education around the world, human rights issues, providing economic assistance to third world countries, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the Food and Agricultural Administration. They try to help these third world countries rebuild. They try and protect refugees. They try and help after natural disasters and war. However, security will be the big issue throughout most of the remainder of the 20th century. And I'll go a few more minutes here because what happens is the United States and the Soviet Union are going to start building weapons. It's known as the arms race, and security and the balance of power in the world is kept by a balance of terror. The United States and Soviet Union were able to blow each other up many, many, many times over. So we're going to start here with President Truman. And Truman saw the ideology of communism as an evil force, which it is, in my opinion, no offense, that was slowly trying to spread across, to try and ooze like a blob across the world. Unlike the isolationist U.S. presidents after World War I, President Truman decides to take a leading role in global affairs, and number one priority was to combat the growing spread of communism. So on March 12, 1947, he will come up with what is called the Truman Doctrine and what we know as the containment policy. And it basically states that the United States must support any free people of the world who are resisting attempted subjugation of armed minorities or outside pressures. Which means communism is okay where it is, but it cannot spread. It's like President Lincoln before the Civil War. I understand slavery is legal where it is, but it cannot spread. And Greece and Turkey were among the very first countries to receive aid so they could, help stop the growing spread or threat of communism in their countries. Truman also stated that the free people of the world are looking to the United States, looking to Team America for leadership. And the Truman Doctrine is going to guide the United States foreign policy for the next 50 years, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. At its core, the Truman Doctrine was designed to resist the expansion of communism no matter where it flared up in any part of the world. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. But it will limit communism to all areas where it already existed. It was not going to spread. And it was American economist George Kenan, think of like Kenan Stadium. It was one of the main writers and architects of the containment policy. And he said that communism simply cannot exist long term. Eventually, if we just give it enough rope and try and keep pace with it, it will collapse upon itself. Its economic viability isn't going to work. And he said that the United States should be able to prevent the expansion from where communism currently exists. Let it be where it is. It will collapse upon itself. But Stalin views the containment policy as a direct attack on the Soviet Union, because it means that the Soviet and its communist countries will be surrounded by Western ideals of capitalism. And so very quickly after the war is ended, the Truman Doctrine was written, the Berlin Crisis and the Airlift was over, we signed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, in 1949. It was created by Western countries like the United States, Canada, France, Great Britain, who decided to form a defensive alliance. 11 member countries will start up. Think of ancient Greece. It's the Delian and the Peloponnesian League. We all agreed to support each other if another one is attacked by the Soviet Union or a communist country. To counter this, Stalin will create, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. 7 member countries that buffer between Germany and the Soviet Union, Soviet satellite states. And they pledged that if anyone were attacked by a Western country, the rest would come to their aid. In the eyes of many, the big difference between NATO and the Warsaw Pact was that NATO members were able to volunteer. You willingly joined, where in the Warsaw Pact, you were forced to. They were a tool, an extension of the Soviet Union. And they took direct commands from the Soviet Politburo in Moscow. Once again, check out the movie Bridge of Spies. I'm going to stop it right there. I don't know how long this is. I may add a part 2 to it that you guys will watch on Wednesday while I'm at this meeting. Next, we're going to go through some more Cold War, Israel-Palestine, and Cuba, and some other things. So, see you guys soon.